On a warm spring evening in Burbank, the studio lights of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson glowed like a second sun. Technicians moved with practiced precision. Stagehands whispered into headsets. The band tuned their instruments. Outside, a restless line of fans stretched along the sidewalk, hoping to glimpse a legend. That night, the guest was Elvis Presley. And at the desk, reviewing his cards with calm focus, sat Johnny Carson. Johnny had interviewed presidents, actors, astronauts, and icons. He had mastered timing. He could sense a joke before it landed. He could feel when an audience was about to laugh. But that evening, something in the air felt heavier than usual. Not dramatic, not obvious, just different. Backstage, Elvis sat quietly in his dressing room. He wore a dark, tailored suit instead of a glittering jumpsuit. It was simple, almost understated. A stylist dabbed makeup onto his face, trying to soften the exhaustion around his eyes. Elvis thanked her politely. His voice was softer than it used to be. He looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. He did not see the king of rock and roll. He did not see the screaming stadiums or the gold records. He saw a man who had been running for a very long time. Outside the door, members of his entourage spoke in hushed tones. They were used to protecting him from crowds, from questions, from rumors. But tonight, there was something they could not protect him from. Fatigue. Not just physical fatigue. The kind that settles in the soul. Elvis stood slowly. His body moved carefully, like someone aware of every joint. He adjusted his collar. He breathed deeply once, twice. "Ready, sir?" someone asked gently. Elvis nodded. On stage, Johnny finished his monologue. The audience laughed at his closing line. The band gave a playful sting. "And now," Johnny said, smiling toward the camera, "we have a very special guest tonight." The applause began before he finished the introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley." The curtain parted. Elvis walked out. The audience exploded with cheers. People stood. Some cried, some clapped above their heads. It was not just applause, it was gratitude, it was memory, it was decades of music pouring out in sound. Johnny stood to greet him. And that was the moment he noticed it. Not the weight gain. Not the slower walk. Not even the tired eyes. It was the hesitation. Just a half-second pause before Elvis stepped fully into the light. Johnny shook his hand. The grip was gentle, warmer than expected, slightly unsteady. "Good to have you back," Johnny said. "It's good to be here," Elvis replied. His smile was there, but it felt practiced. They sat. The audience slowly quieted. Johnny began with easy questions, music, travel, memories from Memphis. Elvis answered politely, sometimes even charmingly. He told a short story about recording late at night. The audience laughed. But Johnny watched carefully. Elvis blinked more than usual. He cleared his throat often. His hands rested on his knees, fingers lightly curled inward. 8 minutes passed. Johnny leaned back casually. "After everything you've done, after all these years, what still excites you about performing?" It was a safe question. A familiar one. Elvis looked down. His hands moved slightly. And then Johnny saw it. A tremor. Not dramatic, not theatrical. But real. Elvis placed one hand over the other, as if to calm it. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came at first. The audience waited. He swallowed. "You know, when I first started," Elvis said slowly, "I just wanted to sing, that was it, just sing." His voice carried a softness that felt different from interviews past. "I didn't think about being famous, didn't think about being, well, Elvis Presley." A few people chuckled warmly. But Elvis did not smile. "Somewhere along the way," he continued, "it became bigger than me, bigger than the music." Johnny leaned slightly forward, not interrupting. "And when something gets bigger than you," Elvis said, "you try to live up to it every day. You try not to disappoint it." The room had grown very still. Johnny chose his words carefully. "Is that hard?" Elvis looked at him. And in that glance, something unguarded flickered. "It can be," he admitted. "Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just honest." He adjusted his cuff. I think people sometimes forget, Elvis continued, that the fellow singing is still just a fellow. A soft ripple of understanding moved through the audience. Johnny nodded gently. That's something a lot of people probably don't think about. Elvis gave a faint smile. It's all right, it comes with the territory. But Johnny heard what was underneath. Weariness. Not complaint. Not bitterness. Just wait. They went to commercial. The applause sign flashed. The band played. Johnny turned slightly toward Elvis while the cameras were off. You doing all right? He asked quietly. Elvis nodded. Just tired, Johnny, been a long road. Johnny did not press. When they returned live, the energy shifted again. Johnny steered toward lighter territory, movies, favorite songs, childhood memories. Elvis brightened slightly when talking about his mother. His eyes softened when mentioning Lisa Marie. For a moment, the audience glimpsed warmth unconnected to fame. But the fatigue remained. Near the end, Johnny asked, "Would you mind singing something for us?" The crowd applauded eagerly. Elvis hesitated, just slightly. Then he stood. The band began a slow introduction. Elvis closed his eyes as he sang. His voice was not as powerful as it once was, but it carried something deeper now. Experience. Fragility. Longing. Every note felt intentional. The audience did not scream this time. They listened. There was a tenderness in the room that had nothing to do with celebrity. It was human. When he finished, the applause rose slowly, then fully. Not wild, not chaotic. Respectful. Elvis returned to his seat, breathing heavier than before. Johnny looked at him with something more than professional admiration. He saw a man carrying invisible weight. As the show ended, Johnny offered his thanks. Elvis stood again, waved gently, and exited the stage. The curtain closed. The audience buzzed with emotion. Backstage, Elvis removed his jacket slowly. He sat for a moment alone, staring at the dressing room mirror once more. The applause still echoed faintly through the hallway. But inside it was quiet. Very quiet. Johnny stepped into the doorway a few minutes later. "Thank you for tonight," he said sincerely. Elvis smiled softly. "Thank you for letting me just be me." Johnny paused. "That's always allowed here," he replied. Elvis nodded. He knew that. But sometimes being just you was the hardest role of all. That night would not make headlines. There was no scandal. No dramatic collapse. No explosive confession. Just a man who seemed tired. Just a host who noticed. Months later, when the world learned of Elvis's passing at age 42, many would revisit that interview. Some would analyze it. Some would speculate. But Johnny remembered something simpler. He remembered the pause before the curtain. He remembered the tremor in the hand. He remembered the way Elvis said, "The fellow singing is still just a fellow." And he understood something he had always known, but never felt so deeply. Behind every legend, behind every spotlight, behind every roar of applause, there is a human being. And sometimes, the bravest thing that human being can do is sit under the lights and tell the truth. When the applause faded and the red recording light dimmed above the stage of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the studio did not immediately return to its usual noise. Something lingered in the air, something fragile and difficult to name. Crew members moved carefully, almost quietly, as if instinctively aware that what had just happened under the bright lights had not been ordinary entertainment. It had felt like something more intimate, something unplanned and deeply human. Johnny Carson remained seated at his desk for a moment longer than usual, staring at the empty chair where Elvis Presley had been sitting. Johnny had hosted thousands of conversations. He could sense when a guest was nervous, when someone was rehearsed, when a story was exaggerated for laughs. But what he had witnessed that night was neither performance nor publicity. It was fatigue worn openly, honesty slipping through the cracks of carefully built fame. Eventually, Johnny stood and walked backstage. The hallway behind the set was narrow, lined with framed photographs of past guests, icons frozen in smiling poses. The walls felt almost ironic now. Fame captured in perfect stillness. Fame preserved, fame framed. Yet the living person behind that fame was far more complicated. Elvis's dressing room door was slightly open. Johnny knocked gently before stepping inside. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Elvis was seated in front of the mirror, his jacket folded neatly beside him. Without the audience, without the music, he looked smaller somehow. Not diminished in importance, but reduced to the simple truth of being a man alone in a quiet room. Johnny did not begin with jokes. He did not shift into host mode. He simply stood beside Elvis for a moment, sharing the silence. That silence said more than any scripted remark ever could. "You gave them something real tonight," Johnny said finally. His voice was low, steady, sincere. Elvis gave a faint smile without looking up. "Did I?" "Yes," Johnny replied, "more than you know." Elvis studied his reflection. The makeup had begun to crease at the corners of his eyes. He reached for a towel and gently wiped his face, revealing the skin beneath, tired, human, unfiltered. "It gets heavy sometimes," Elvis admitted. His tone was not dramatic. It carried no plea for sympathy. It was simply an acknowledgement, being what people expect. Johnny leaned against the counter. He understood expectations. He understood the invisible contract between celebrity and audience. "People love you," Johnny said carefully. "I know," Elvis answered. "That's what makes it harder." The words hung in the room. Elvis explained, slowly and thoughtfully, how the crowds never stopped wanting the same energy, the same voice, the same spark that had once come so easily. He spoke about tour that blurred into one another, hotel rooms that felt interchangeable, conversations that were always about business or schedules or image. He did not complain. He reflected. "There's a difference between being seen," Elvis said, "and being known." Johnny felt that sentence settle deep inside him. He had spent his career observing people, yet how often had he paused to consider what it meant to truly know them beyond the stage? Elvis continued speaking, not rapidly, not with urgency, but with the slow honesty of someone who had been carrying thoughts alone for too long. He talked about his love for music when it was simple, when it was just sound and feeling and connection. He described how that early joy had slowly transformed into obligation. Appearances, headlines, expectations. "I'm grateful," Elvis emphasized. "I don't want anyone to think I'm not grateful." Johnny nodded. Gratitude and exhaustion could coexist. Success and loneliness could coexist. Public admiration did not erase private struggle. A member of Elvis's team knocked lightly on the door to signal it was time to leave. The car was ready. Schedules were tight. There was always somewhere else to be. Elvis stood slowly. He adjusted his collar once more, as if preparing to step back into the armor of fame. Before leaving, he turned to Johnny. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Johnny asked. "For not trying to make it funny when it wasn't funny." Johnny gave a small nod. That perhaps was the highest compliment a talk show host could receive. They shook hands again. This time the tremor was still there, but Johnny felt something else beneath it, relief. For a brief moment, Elvis had not been the symbol, the myth, the king. He had simply been a man speaking honestly. As Elvis walked down the hallway and out toward the exit, crew members stepped aside respectfully. Some smiled. Some looked concerned. No one said much. The car door closed softly, the engine started, and then he was gone. Johnny returned to his office but found it difficult to move on to the next day's preparation. The cards on his desk suddenly felt trivial. The jokes he had planned for upcoming guests seemed lighter than usual. He replayed moments from the interview in his mind, the pause before answering, the tremor, the careful choice of words. He was not a doctor, he was not a counselor, but he was a man who had looked into another man's eyes and seen something fragile. In the days that followed, viewers wrote letters to the network. Some praised Elvis's performance. Some expressed concern about his health. Others said they had never seen him so open. The interview quietly became one of the most talked-about appearances of the season, yet it was not scandal that fueled conversation. It was vulnerability. Johnny read several of the letters himself. One in particular stayed with him. A viewer had written that seeing Elvis speak so honestly made her feel less alone in her own exhaustion. That watching a legend admit he was tired gave her permission to admit the same about her own life. That letter changed something inside Johnny. He realized that the stage was not just a place for laughter or promotion. It could also be a place where humanity showed through the cracks of performance. Months passed. Elvis continued touring, Reports circulated in magazines, some kind, some harsh. Fame remained relentless. Then on an August afternoon, news arrived that stopped everything. Elvis Presley had died at the age of 42. The nation reacted with disbelief and sorrow. Radios interrupted programming. Television anchors spoke in hushed tones. Fans gathered outside Graceland in stunned silence. Johnny stood in his office watching the news bulletin. He felt a wave of sadness that was both personal and collective. The memory of that interview resurfaced with painful clarity. The pause, the tired smile, the sentence about being known versus being seen. That evening, Johnny walked onto his stage again. The lights were just as bright. The audience was full, but the mood was different. Before showing clips from past appearances, Johnny addressed viewers directly. His voice remained steady, but his eyes carried weight. He spoke not about record sales or chart positions. He spoke about courage, about honesty, about the cost of carrying expectations without rest. He did not speculate. He did not dramatize. He honored the human being behind the legend. In the years that followed, Johnny would continue hosting with the same sharp wit and precise timing. But something had deepened. He listened more closely. He asked quieter follow-up questions. He paid attention to what was unsaid. The night Elvis sat in that chair did not end with a grand farewell or dramatic declaration. It ended with a handshake and a quiet thank you. Yet its impact stretched far beyond those 22 minutes of broadcast. It became a reminder that even the brightest stars are made of flesh and breath and fragile endurance. Fame can amplify applause, but it can also amplify loneliness. Success can build monuments, but it cannot shield the heart from exhaustion. And sometimes the most meaningful moment on television is not the loudest one. It is the moment when someone chooses to be honest in front of millions. That was what Johnny saw coming, not tragedy in a prophetic sense, but the unmistakable signs of a man who had been carrying too much for too long. And that awareness stayed with him long after the studio lights dimmed. In the weeks after that final appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, life in Burbank returned to its familiar rhythm. Scripts were written, rehearsals were scheduled, punchlines were tested and refined. The machinery of television did what it always did. It moved forward. Yet inside the mind of Johnny Carson, something had shifted in a way that was subtle but permanent. He had hosted thousands of conversations, but that night with Elvis Presley lingered like a quiet echo that would not fade. Johnny found himself replaying certain expressions from memory, not the applause, not the song, not even the words that viewers would later quote. What stayed with him were the spaces between the words, the pauses that stretched half a second too long, the careful breathing before answering, the way Elvis's gaze occasionally drifted beyond the cameras as though searching for something unreachable. Johnny understood performance. He had built a career on it. But he also understood when a man was speaking from somewhere unguarded. Across the country, Elvis continued touring. The arenas were still full. The fans were still devoted. Every night, lights flashed and voices roared as he stepped on stage. To the crowd, he remained larger than life. The costumes glittered, the introductions thundered, and the songs stirred decades of shared memory. Yet backstage, the routine felt heavier than it once had. Those close to him noticed that he moved more slowly between sets, that he often sat quietly before performances rather than pacing with restless energy as he had in younger years. He fulfilled commitments faithfully, but something within him seemed reflective, almost distant, as though he were carrying a private awareness that few could see. Elvis had always given his audience his full presence. That was part of his gift. He did not merely sing, he connected. But connection requires energy, and energy is not infinite. In hotel rooms after shows, he would sometimes sit by the window long after the noise had faded, looking at city lights blinking in the darkness. He was not brooding. He was thinking about the early days in Memphis when music had felt simple and alive. Thinking about the weight of expectations that had gradually grown around him like invisible armor. Armor can protect, but it can also grow heavy. Meanwhile, Johnny's memory of that dressing room conversation continued to deepen. He did not share it publicly. He did not dramatize it in interviews, but privately he began to approach his work differently. When new guests came on the show, young actors promoting films, musicians launching albums, Johnny listened more carefully to tone rather than just content. He noticed fatigue more quickly. He sensed hesitation sooner. He allowed silence to sit a little longer if a guest needed space to gather themselves. The experience with Elvis had taught him that behind every polished answer might be an unspoken truth waiting to surface. The public, however, saw something else entirely. They saw headlines about tour dates and album sales. They saw photographs from concerts where Elvis still commanded attention with charisma and presence. Fame has a way of smoothing edges in photographs. It does not capture exhaustion between songs. It does not record quiet moments after applause. It freezes the image at its brightest point. As summer unfolded, the physical toll on Elvis became harder to ignore. He was still devoted to his fans. He still greeted them warmly, still signed autographs when possible, still expressed gratitude for their loyalty. But those who watched closely could sense that maintaining the pace required more effort than before. His voice, though still capable of stirring emotion, sometimes carried strain. His movements were measured rather than fluid. None of this erased his talent, it simply revealed his humanity. Johnny followed these developments from afar, not as a gossip seeker, but as someone who had once looked into Elvis's eyes and recognized vulnerability. He felt concern, but also respect. He understood that adults make their own choices, that life's path is rarely simple. He resisted speculation, choosing instead to hold on to the memory of that honest conversation backstage. He remembered the sentence that had resonated deeply. There's a difference between being seen and being known. That idea stayed with him as a quiet reminder that fame, for all its brightness, does not guarantee understanding. Then came the morning in August when news traveled faster than comprehension. Reports broke that Elvis Presley had been found unresponsive at his home in Memphis. At first, details were unclear. Confusion spread. Television stations interrupted programming. Radios shifted tone. Within hours, confirmation arrived. Elvis Presley had died at the age of 42. The reaction was immediate and immense. Crowds gathered outside Graceland. Strangers embraced in airports. Radio stations played his music continuously, each song carrying new meaning in the shadow of loss. The nation mourned not only a performer but a shared chapter of cultural memory. In his office at NBC, Johnny stood silently as the announcement replayed on the screen. He did not speak for several minutes. Those around him could see that he was processing something deeper than shock. He had sensed fragility months earlier. He had seen the fatigue in person. While the world reacted with surprise, Johnny felt a quieter sorrow, a recognition that the warning signs had been there, though perhaps not fully understood. That evening, when he walked onto the Tonight Show stage, the atmosphere was solemn. The audience applauded out of habit, but the energy was subdued. Johnny sat at his desk and looked directly into the camera. He spoke not as a comedian, not as a television personality, but as a man reflecting on another man. He described Elvis as talented, generous, and kind. He avoided speculation about causes or controversies. Instead, he focused on humanity. He mentioned that during Elvis's last appearance on the show, viewers had seen a side rarely displayed on stage: thoughtful, honest, reflective. Johnny emphasized how much courage it takes for someone celebrated as invincible to admit weariness. Clips from previous interviews played, including moments of laughter and warmth. The final appearance, once analyzed casually, now carried heavier significance. Viewers noticed the tremor, the quiet confession, the tired smile. The context of loss changed how every gesture was interpreted, yet Johnny did not frame it as tragedy foretold. He framed it as vulnerability shared. After the tribute, letters flooded NBC once again. Some viewers wrote that they had rewatched the interview with tears. Others expressed regret that signs of exhaustion had not been addressed sooner. Mental health professionals later pointed to the conversation as an example of how public figures sometimes signal internal struggles in subtle ways. But beyond analysis, what endured was a simple realization: even legends are human. Johnny carried that lesson forward. He became more intentional about checking in with guests off camera. He occasionally asked producers to adjust segments if someone appeared overwhelmed. He understood that television reaches millions, but it also involves individuals sitting under lights that can feel intensely isolating. Fame does not erase the need for care. Elvis's passing marked the end of an era, but it also sparked broader conversations about the cost of relentless schedules and the importance of rest and support. Fans revisited his music with renewed tenderness, hearing layers of emotion in songs they had known for years. The narrative of his life became more complex, more nuanced, less defined by glitter and more by humanity. For Johnny, the memory that remained strongest was not the tremor itself, nor the headlines that followed. It was the moment backstage when Elvis thanked him for not forcing humor into seriousness. That small exchange represented mutual respect. It symbolized what television could be at its best, a platform not only for entertainment but for empathy. In time, the rawness of grief softened into remembrance. The Tonight Show continued. New stars rose, audiences changed. Yet within Johnny's quiet reflections, that night in May remained significant. It had reminded him that the brightest lights can cast long shadows, and that sometimes the most meaningful service one person can offer another is simple presence without judgment. Elvis had worn the crown of cultural icon with undeniable influence, but in those final months he also revealed the weight beneath it. The world saw the crown, Johnny saw the weight, and that awareness transformed how he understood not only fame but responsibility. Because when someone steps into the spotlight, they do not stop being human. They carry their doubts, their fatigue, their private battles with them. The applause may be loud, but it does not silence inner questions. That realization did not fade. It became part of Johnny's quiet philosophy. Listen closely, especially when someone famous speaks softly. Years passed after that August evening, yet the memory of that final appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson never left Johnny Carson. Time has a way of softening headlines, of turning breaking news into historical footnotes, but certain moments resist fading. For Johnny, the image of Elvis Presley sitting under the studio lights with quiet honesty remained vivid, almost suspended in memory as if untouched by the passing decades. It was not the spectacle that endured, it was the stillness. It was the pause before an answer. It was the way Elvis had spoken about being seen versus being known. That distinction continued to echo long after applause had dissolved into silence. In the public narrative, Elvis became a legend enshrined in music history, remembered for groundbreaking performances, cultural impact, and a voice that reshaped American sound. Tributes celebrated his influence. Biographies analyzed his rise. Fans preserved his legacy with devotion. Yet behind the monuments of memory, there was also the quieter story of a man who had once admitted fatigue in front of millions. Johnny understood that both stories could coexist. Greatness and vulnerability are not opposites, they are often intertwined. As Johnny moved deeper into the later years of his career, he carried that awareness like a private compass. Guests who sat across from him might not have realized the shift, but those who worked closely with him noticed subtle changes. He allowed more space for reflection during interviews. He occasionally let silence linger instead of rushing to fill it with humor. He became more attuned to tone, to posture, to the small signs that someone might be navigating more than what appeared on the surface. He did not transform into a therapist or abandon comedy. Rather, he expanded his understanding of what a late-night stage could hold. It could carry laughter, yes, but it could also carry truth. The interview with Elvis gradually gained recognition as one of the most poignant moments in late-night television history. Media historians revisited it in documentaries and retrospectives. Cultural commentators analyzed the significance of that final televised conversation. Some interpreted it as a farewell, others as a reflection of exhaustion under pressure. Yet Johnny himself resisted grand conclusions. When asked about it in later interviews, he spoke with measured respect. He emphasized Elvis's courage in choosing honesty. He reminded listeners that no one can fully understand another person's private battles. He avoided sensationalism because he believed that memory deserved dignity. Privately, Johnny sometimes wondered about the moments that lead a person to speak so openly. He reflected on the complexity of fame, how it magnifies success while often isolating the individual behind it. He thought about how public figures can become symbols so large that the person inside struggles to breathe. These reflections did not make him cynical. They made him compassionate. He began to recognize that fame is not immunity from struggle, but often an amplifier of it. The expectations grow louder, the schedule grows tighter, and the space for ordinary rest becomes smaller. Elvis's legacy continued to inspire generations. His recordings played on radios and later through digital platforms, bridging decades with the same emotional resonance. Young artists cited him as an influence. Fans who had grown older with him shared stories of how his music had accompanied pivotal moments in their lives. Yet the final interview added a different layer to that legacy. It reminded audiences that even the most celebrated voices carry human complexity. The tremor in his hands, once barely noticed, became symbolic of the truth that strength and fragility can exist simultaneously. For Johnny, the lesson extended beyond celebrity. It touched something universal. He realized that in everyday life, people often perform roles expected of them, professional, parent, partner, leader, while quietly managing burdens unseen by others. The world applauds achievement but rarely pauses to ask about exhaustion. The interview had become more than a television memory. It was a reflection on empathy. It urged a simple but powerful practice. Look closely, listen carefully, and remember that everyone you meet carries an invisible story. When Johnny eventually retired from hosting, tributes celebrated his wit, timing, and influence on television. Yet among his most meaningful contributions was something quieter, his ability to create space where authenticity could surface. The night Elvis spoke candidly had shown him the importance of that space. It was not about exposing vulnerability for drama. It was about honoring it with respect. That approach shaped how he viewed interviews in his final years, how he valued sincerity over spectacle. In the broader cultural conversation, Elvis's final months were examined with sensitivity. Historians and biographers approached his story with nuance, acknowledging both triumphs and struggles without reducing him to either. The narrative matured. The world learned to speak about public figures with more awareness of mental and emotional health. While progress remained imperfect, conversations about well-being in demanding industries became more common. In subtle ways, moments like that interview contributed to a larger understanding that even icons need care and compassion. Looking back, the night did not represent prophecy or inevitability. It represented connection. A host recognized fatigue. A performer admitted humanity. Millions watched. The exchange did not solve anything. It did not reverse circumstances. But it did something meaningful. It reminded viewers that honesty is powerful, especially when shared by someone often viewed as untouchable. Johnny sometimes thought about the handshake at the end of that show. It had been simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried unspoken acknowledgement. Two professionals standing under bright lights, aware that what mattered most in that moment was not ratings but respect. That handshake symbolized something larger than entertainment. It symbolized shared humanity. As years turned into decades, the clip of that interview remained accessible to new audiences discovering it for the first time. Viewers who had not been alive during Elvis's career watched the exchange with curiosity and empathy. They saw a cultural icon speaking softly about fatigue, and they recognized a universal truth. Everyone reaches moments of weariness. Everyone longs to be known beyond expectation. The footage became timeless not because of drama, but because of honesty. The enduring power of that night lies not in sorrow, but in awareness. It encourages reflection about how society treats its heroes and how individuals treat one another. It suggests that applause, while beautiful, should not replace listening. It gently challenges the idea that success equals invulnerability, and it offers a quiet call toward kindness, the kind that asks someone how they are truly doing and waits patiently for the answer. In the end, what Johnny saw coming was not a headline or a date. It was the unmistakable sign of a man carrying too much. He recognized it because he had learned, through years of conversation, how to notice subtle shifts in tone and posture. That recognition did not make him a savior or a predictor. It made him attentive, and attentiveness is often the first step toward compassion. Elvis's music continues to play. Johnny's legacy continues in the format he helped define. But beyond the fame and the history, there remains the simple truth revealed under studio lights one May evening. Behind every crown stands a person who sometimes feels tired. And when that person finds the courage to say so, the most meaningful response is not applause but understanding.